Hello? 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 Give me a thumbs up whenever we're rolling. Kim, we're rolling. We're live. That's right, Fred Durst. I don't think that's who sang that one. All right. Welcome to Words for Sale, guys. Yeah, go ahead. First, I want to thank you for coming and supporting Midwestern authors and poets. And if you happen to be at home right now, watching the live stream, I would like to thank you for giving us your living room or your bedroom or wherever it is that you physically are at this moment. Thank you to Laura Gomel and the 317 Art Collective for providing us with a venue. Big thanks to Gazzardo Performance Music for providing the sound equipment. Gazzardo's Performance Music is all employee owned, 100%. I'd also like to say hello to my poetry and prose cohorts at Northwestern, and thank my creative nonfiction professor, Natalie Moore. You guys may know her from WBEZ, for getting the word out to the students on the event. Also, props to Emily Klonecke, wherever she's at, and the Rockford Area Arts Council for their assistance in locating some of the performers. And of course, I'd like to thank the performers themselves for having the bravery or guts or fortitude or whatever you want to call it to get up here and tell their personal stories and share their work. Statistically speaking, research supports the theory that people are more afraid of public speaking than death itself. So the people that you're about to hear from are some very courageous people, to say the least. And of course, I want to thank my lovely wife, Kim, for doing all the technical directing and the live stream and putting up for me for 2 months for this event. Thank you, Kim. So Words for Sale came to me first as an idea for a short story. In the story, characters were charged for each word they spoke, and they were only allowed to use words after they had purchased them. It had a sort of Twilight Zone vibe to it. And on the surface, it may seem like a work of fiction, but in reality, it's closer to the truth than we'd like to admit. Words seem free, but every word has a price. Some take up more space. Some cost us a lot of money. Some can even impact our physical and mental well-being. All of you have been through so much during this pandemic that it's easy to forget everything that we took for granted before it started. And yet, in the face of everything that you guys have been through, you're here tonight with us. And tonight, the word that we're going to talk about is coping. Learning to cope with trauma, whether physical or emotional, is an important part of growth as a human being. I tell you this right now, for those of you who are waiting for the world to return back to the normal, you're going to keep waiting because it's never going back. This is the new normal. This is now. This is the reality of the moment. This is the new world, but it's also our world. This is the present, and this second right now is a moment in our reality. And while we have all suffered through it, we have also progressed. Many people are taking a second look at what is important in their lives, and big surprise, it's not work. Coping comes before labor, before money, before food, and maybe even before love. Because if we haven't coped from past trauma, how can we expect it to not invade our present lives? How do we cope? How do we rid ourselves of the past and begin to live in the present? Well, first we have to admit that we are living in the present, and we got to let go of the past. This is, of course, easier said than done. What if we can't rid ourselves of the past? What if we must live with constant reminders of former trauma? We cannot change what happened. This is an absolute truth, but we can control how we feel about it. We can tell our stories, either to others or to ourselves, to lessen the blow. We can share ourselves. We can really put ourselves out there on display in the hope that we can help others. We can use cadence and rhythm and human and even power, because we can control these memories, those thoughts, in constructive ways. That's how we cope. We cope by sharing our words. Tonight, you will hear from 4 performers who are using their past experiences as a means of reaching out to you, the audience, with the hope that at least one of you will begin the process of healing. Some will use humor, others will use hard truths. There might be moments of comfort, and there may be moments that are uncomfortable. But together, we will cope as a collective, as a community, as neighbors, and as strangers. So it's my honor and privilege to begin tonight's event with a story from my own past. This is the first time I'm going to be reading it aloud in front of an audience. And while I'm terrified, I'm also hopeful. I'm hopeful that you will laugh with me in the face of trauma. I'm hopeful that you will understand that I'm not up here for the sake of pity. I'm up here to tell you a story that no doubt shaped who I am and how I cope with trauma. This story will be included in a collection of nonfiction pieces that I'm working on called Fireworks, albeit delayed. This is the story of my grandmother, the only grandmother that I knew and the only grandmother that I will ever have. Thank you. All right. That's my brother, Mikey. I gave him $50 to say that, and he almost had it on time. Almost. Man, this is a story called Grandmother. When the word grandmother is thrown around, some may conjure up images of freshly baked cookies held out by the hands of white-haired Mrs. Cloth. And for that, I am sometimes envious. My grandmother loved cigarettes. Her favorite film was the 1978 classic Piranha, of which she owned a dubbed VHS edited for television version, complete with commercial bookends. She was a tyrant. She never smiled. I can't remember her kiss, though I'm sure it was veiled in nicotine. For some reason, I recall the smell of Ben Gay. These memories, of course, are filtered through the eyes of a child with a thought process lacking a fully developed brain. But now these memories have had time to ferment, and they've grown spiny with hatred at the realization of what we hadn't been given. I wasn't loved. I can say that with complete confidence and truth. I can say that she didn't love me. She didn't really love anything or anyone, except maybe my brother Michael, and I hold no jealousy for her fondness, because who wants the love of the devil but the damned? Truth be told, I'm not sure I even know what her first real name is. The name Joanne comes to mind, and that may have well been her first name, but it's entirely possible that I'm simply be confused because of her frequent visits to Joanne Fabrics. Maybe that was her true love. Joanne Fabrics. Beats me. I don't know much about her personal life. I don't know where she began, but I know that she had family in Summit, Illinois. For those of you from Summit, it's also called Scummit. She was a drunk for a good percentage of time, and she gave that up much later on, but before doing so, she managed to meet my grandfather somewhere, at some point that I've never been told about, and because of that, I exist. My grandfather was named Mickey, but that was not his real name. He changed it. I don't know if it was legally changed, but it was changed soon after he left my great-grandmother, Elzana. I don't know what his real name is or was. I only know that he was a half-Cherokee man from St. Louis, Missouri, who carried a mean fist. It's hard to get the truth out of any of my mother's siblings for the fact that she swore off contact with them many years ago. And many of them have a propensity for bullshit tales about my family's connection to famous Native Americans. But I do recall a Pizza Hut sit-down in which my Uncle Mick told me that my grandfather was an amateur boxer. Was he any good? Well, I know he could hit pretty fucking hard. This sent the table into a mass cackle. The only absolute truths about my grandpa, for which I am certain and can share with you, are the following. Number one, he loved cigarettes. Number two, he had dark black hair, which he slicked back into a pompadour. He had thick Coke bottle glasses. He smelled like grease and aftershave. He loved my brother Michael. His heart gave out on him on a walk home from work. My grandmother gave birth to a total of 8 children, giving one up for adoption. One of my family members met with this estranged woman at some point and concluded that she was just as fucked up as the rest of us, which I'm sure brought great relief to the rest of the family. We're genetically dispositioned to despise people who have any sort of advantage in life that we've missed out on. So we usually poke and we prod until we can find weakness for the purposes of determining ourselves superior. The character trait also provides the family with most of its arguments. Oh, you think you're better me, but you're really insert flaw or deed that the other person has held on to for ammunition for months, if not years. To win is to stay silent and perfect and remain in a state where truths are lessened for fear of giving up any weakness that could be formed into a rope in which they finally hang you, a rope that you fashioned yourself. Aha! We knew it was a ruse. The house, the job, the college degree, the wife, that fancy couch that he bought a year ago, all that shit he shoves in our faces is actually just a blanket to cover up his weaknesses. It's a finely tuned instrument that's taken generations to perfect, and it's best practice to close yourself in armor and never speak in truths or uncertainties. After my Uncle Jesse was born, my grandmother left the hospital and never came back. My grandmother left 7 kids at an old farmhouse. She just went. I can speculate that she was probably helped by the amateur boxer's beatings, and alcohol was certainly involved. But what about the 7 kids? Wild animals don't even abandon their children until they're able to protect and care for themselves. What my aunts and uncles must have thought after the first month, the hope slowly leaving their small child bodies, will never be known to me. If it were the beatings that made her leave, then she had to know that my grandfather's hands would find a substitute. And so he did, on the small bodies and on small faces. The prediction of these future beatings had to have visited my grandmother's mind during her escape. What about sacrifice? How could anyone leave their own children to suffer, and suffer they did? The children were subject to legendary cruelties and punishments during my grandmother's absence, and out of respect for my family's privacy, I will not repeat what I have heard and what I believe to be true. The first memory that I have of my grandmother is her arrival to my small house in Rochelle, Illinois. The house had been purchased by my mother with the money my grandfather left when the cigarettes finally won. I'm told the price tag was $12,000. It was stationed about a block downstream from the meatpacking plant where my parents had first met, so the faint smell of hog shit and bacon was a constant companion. My father cut out the livers, and my mother was a scale girl. This career did not last long for either of them, but that didn't stop us from continuing to live in the district even after the union was busted and cheap labor was brought in. My father moved on to concrete. My mother worked at a cannery until she got carpal tunnel. We weren't rich, but we had a house, which was more than my grandmother could say for herself. So, one day, like a broke-ass Mary Poppins, she found herself hovering over my doorstep. This doorstep to that house that she had abandoned her own husband and he had paid for. She was a small and lumpy thing. Her face looked like it had been dragged through a field of sandpaper. Her eyes were sunken in her sockets, which were surrounded by these large bags. Her voice, nurtured through decades of constant cigarette fumes, was reminiscent of glass being filtered through 10 tons of gravel. Short hair, false teeth, bedazzled Joanne Fabrics handmade sweaters. This creature slid herself into our basement, and she became the home's chimney. The first trouble hit our house when my mom and dad decided to trust my grandmother to babysit the 3 kids. The irony being that this was the same woman who had deserted her own. But my grandmother was now reliant on my family for shelter, and she was older and without transportation. So the threat of another episode of abandonment was minimal. My parents rarely went out on dates and probably wanted to get something out of having the old bitch smoke up their basement. So I can't place any blame on them for wanting to spend some quality time alone. The local fancy restaurant was called The Beacon, and I'm sure this was their destination, but I can't be 100%. It was at some point while they were away that my sister, my brother, and myself decided that a revolution was in order. I didn't like her. I didn't know what a grandmother was supposed to be, but my prepubescent brain had associated the word grandmother with monster. She hated all of us by this point, even my brother Michael. She didn't want to be living in our basement, and she sure as hell didn't want to be surrounded by children, or God forbid, her having some sort of responsibility over them. She wanted cigarettes and solitude, like a dragon amassed over an infinite pile of treasure beneath a stronghold. We were told, don't wake the beast. I couldn't have been more than 6 years old. My sister Elzana was probably 5. My older brother was 7. We were all very small and extremely frightened at the sound of grandmother's footsteps, ascending the cabinet of deaths into the kitchen, the sulfuric smell of Satan replaced by wafts of sea-gray generic smokes, drawing closer to telling us how she really felt, for the fear of being booted was probably starting to wear off. So it was on that night, the first time my parents would leave our fates in the hand of an insufferable animal to that fancy restaurant, probably ordering the second cheapest thing on the menu, that we decided to confront the ancient hag. "I don't like you," I announced proudly with my siblings standing at my side, not knowing the outcome and not really understanding who it was exactly that I was speaking to. There was a nothingness behind those ancient grandmother eyes. They were blank. I was staring into an abyss. There wasn't any recognizable facial reaction because her permanent expression seemed to be a Guinness contender for the longest scowl in history. Her response was the exact opposite of abandonment, I suppose. I cannot for the life of me remember the exact wording, but it went something like this: "Why don't you leave?" The counter that I now understood was cruelty was then mistaken as a challenge. "I'll help you pack." Woof! Another crushing blow from Grandma from the top ropes. We countered by fleeing into our rooms, and she followed, sluggishly in pursuit. I don't remember packing, but I know that it happened quickly. In minutes, we were on the front porch of the house without any sort of destination. That's when we realized who it was we had revolted against. The Joseph Stalin of the meatpacking district. There was no recourse, other than crying, as children will do, but our tears went unnoticed. She was back inside the house, puffing away. Front door was locked. We stayed put until we saw the headlights of my parents' car slow down to pull in the driveway, and then we mobbed them. Their expressions were first confusion, followed by immediate anger. My father went into an absolute state of rage, and that is where this memory leaves me. Not because of anything that needs to be repressed, but because it was a long time ago. In the following years, my mother eventually forgave her, probably due to some sort of emotional manipulation. She faked cancer at some point, or that may have been my mother, or aunt, or maybe all of them. My family is lousy with hypochondriacs, and myself included. But in any case, the children found themselves being shoved into some sort of sleepover arrangement in an attempt to bond with the unbondable. "You're spending the night at Grandma's." These were the words that you never wished to hear, because even though time had passed, she had never forgotten the attempted coup. Even worse than knowing that she hadn't forgotten was that she had nothing but time to smoke and to calculate the exact amount of abuse that my parents would tolerate. These were usually solo trips for me, even though I was the grandchild she hated the most. And at this point in my life, my grandmother was living in a small apartment with an illiterate man who slept in the pantry on an old army cot. The apartment was a mixture of 1 part sauna to 1 part fog machine. The windows might as well have been nailed shut as much as they were given used. Tall drinking cups filled with bundles of cigarettes were placed throughout the apartment for ease of access, because when my grandmother wanted or needed to smoke, she couldn't be bothered with physically moving. She'd rather just fetch a 100 out of one of those cups than take the extra 5 seconds to pull one out of the pack. Her lungs were constantly being barbecued, and as such, so were mine during these sessions of shitty VHS television movies accompanied by the dirty dancing soundtrack. The only respite from the smoke was the inevitable Joann's Fabrics outing for more yarn to make socks or custom bedazzled Christmas sweaters that we'd throw in the garbage. I'll admit, however, the yarn socks were kind of nice. One was capable of sliding vast distances across laminate flooring in them. Her domain was the kind of place that made you feel like time was a physical being that you had insulted at some point. Sweet Jesus. I couldn't wait for her to call lights out during my first visit, until I realized I'd be bunking on my own army cot next to this very slow, creepy man who provided my grandmother with his Social Security checks. The sounds that escaped his throat as he slept made sleep without nightmares impossible. And this is probably the reason why my grandmother made sure to get a few belts of NyQuil in before heading off to her own room. And just as I would start to escape, as I would begin drifting into sleep on that hard green mesh cot, there'd come a flickering sound from the next room over as my grandmother awoke from her slumber to take a quick smoke break. And then morning would come, signaled by pastel beams of light passing through the billowing furnace of the living room kitchenette. On one such morning, I was presented with a meal of stale, generic cornflakes that were probably rationed away during the Dust Bowl. Accompanying the dish was the constant smoldering exhale of fog from my grandmother's chest. "I can't finish," I said. "You're not going anywhere until you do." Fine, I thought. I'm just going to wait this old bitch out if she wants to play hard. But she was as angry at life as she was patient. So I was basically dealing with a sentient, pissed-off mountain, or a volcano because of those smoke. And as the beams of light changed while I sat at that table, so did the consistencies of those once hardened flakes, which eventually became a thick beige paste after sitting for an hour or so. I spooned carefully, closing my eyes and trying to shove the cud to the back of my throat so I'd miss the texture and the taste. I gagged. "I can't finish. Don't you get up from that fucking chair, David." Silent tears streamed down my face, but there was no relief. I was a substitute entertainment for those VHS tapes now. She was packed in tight on a chair in the living room next to her bucket of smokes and yarn. She watched me out of the corner of her eye. She watched me gag and down every disgusting spoonful of gruel like a bully forcing dog shit into a weakling's mouth until the event was over. I was finally able to leave the kitchen table when the afternoon sun replaced the orange morning glow.
She still made some boogies, though.
She did. She made some kumpas, that's right. I was on my way to sniper phase of special reaction team training when the captain informed me that I'd gotten a Red Cross message from back home. My grandma was dying, and I'd been given a pass to fly from South Korea to Illinois for a week. I hadn't thought about her much in adult years, but I was happy to get away from all the military trial runs that I really didn't care about. I hopped on a plane out of Seoul, which brought me to Japan, which then brought me to LAX, which then brought me to O'Hare, but not to a hero's welcome. My family never picked me up from the airport when I came back. There were never any welcome home signs or waving flags or tears of joy or warmth. There was only the polished flooring and bustling crowds of the airport, followed by a mad rush to try and make it over to the bus terminal to catch the Van Gelder bound for Rockford. It left hourly, so I'd call my folks and let them know that it landed safely, and I'd give them an ETA on my Rockford arrival, continuously reminding them of the time in an attempt to hypnotize them into giving a shit. I'd be at the clock tower 412. 412, okay? 412, clock tower. The excitement would begin like Charlie Brown mid-football kick, as the scenery from I-90 looked less like northern suburbs and more like southern Wisconsin. The bus would pull into the clock tower exactly on time, and then I would exit the bus searching for my father's head, which never appeared, every single time. He was known for being late and probably on his way, I'd tell myself. After the first 15 minutes, but as more time continued to pass, I'd eventually admit defeat and pick up a payphone. My father would answer. "I'm at the clock tower, Dad." "Okay, I'm leaving now." He never even tried to leave the house before the phone call, but I was always surprised at the level of neglect that continued even into adulthood. So, after South Korea, Japan, LAX, O'Hare, an hour and a half on the bus ride to Rockford, followed by 45 minutes of waiting for my father to arrive before calling him and waiting another 30 minutes, I'd see his work truck on the horizon and exhale a sigh of relief. I was home again, whatever good it gave me. My grandmother didn't look any worse for the wear. Her eyes may have been a bit more sunken in. She had shrunken a bit. Maybe I'd just grown. She carried the tanks of oxygen with her and wrapped a tube around her head into her nostrils. The initial hug was cold as it had ever been, a reminder that not all people possess the ability to change. We weren't alone much during that visit, save one last day before I had to head back. She sat out on the front porch with the oxygen tank and the tubing coming off her face, and she sucked the butt of a cigarette. I joined her. We both sat on the wooden bench and avoided eye contact. The hate was still there. I could feel it in the sides of her eyes, but the thoughts were cloudier, and death was approaching. I felt the need to say something. Something that mattered. What I wanted, more than anything from her, was closure. I wanted an answer to a question that had bothered me since I was able to realize that she had abandoned her own children. So, just like the child in that meatpacking neighborhood did before, summon up the bravery to speak to her and possibly appeal to any sort of humanity or compassion that may have existed beyond those eyes. Grandma? Yeah. You ever feel bad about leaving your kids? She took a puff off her cigarette in the chain, and then she responded, staring straight ahead, focusing on nothing. I was young. And that was it. That's the closest I would ever get to an answer. Even in death, she was stubborn, defiant, narcissistic. Every person that becomes older at one point or time was younger. So that's not exactly a resounding apology or a confession that I was hoping for. A vast majority of human beings, most of them, in fact, never abandon their children because they're young. And certainly not 7 times over. I wanted something, any answer before she signed off. I wanted this chapter to finally go away, but there wasn't going to be any closure. That much was crystal clear. And in the days that I went back to Korea, when she had given a prefabricated notebook, she was given a prefabricated notebook by my mother. The pages of the notebook were set up like worksheets that were to be filled out by the owner. The headings of the pages were questions about the dying person had accomplished or seen or enjoyed while they were younger and not on death's door. They were meant to be kept by the family after passing and read aloud to each other. The idea of a circle of loved ones passing around the thoughts of a ghost, to be remembered, to be cried over, to be celebrated. My grandmother had filled out exactly 2 fucking questions and then tossed it aside, leaving the world nothing but a pile of cigarette butts in the bushes in front of the front porch. It was only a few words from what I recall, but there was no substance to any of them. She was cremated shortly after her death. Her remains were placed in a cardboard box and given to my parents. She had no home or place of fondness or wishes beyond the grave. So she went into the garage next to the outdoor decorations and a bag of screwdrivers and hand tools. That's where she exists to this day. This box of ashes often serves as a reminder that I speak of with my father when we talk about purpose and the importance of being a valued member of society. We joke that those who are remembered fondly go into the abyss being wished off well by those who love them, while those who are not end up on a shelf in the garage next to a coffee can and nails and burned out Christmas bulbs. Thank you very much. All right, thank you. It's hard to get out, man, right? That's the point. That's why we're here. Our next performer. Hello? Oh, that's okay. Our next performer is Goddess Warrior, the poet. Let's give you guys a brief intro. Diana Tyler, also known as Goddess Warrior, the poet, developed the courage to openly speak about the pain she spilled through her pen in 2012. She's a domestic violence survivor. She endured the great loss of both parents as a result of it. For nearly a decade, Goddess Warrior had advocated against violence of all kinds. From gun violence to sexual abuse, she has captivated audiences with her powerful performances. She uses the gift of spoken word poetry to be an example of faith, strength, determination, and the sheer will to never give up. After staring out at one of the most infamous open mics in Chicago at E's Sundays, Goddess Warrior, the poet, has now become a trailblazer in her own right. She's a published author, 2021 Chicago Music Award Best Spoken Artist of the Year, the founder and CEO of Words of Warrior Productions, hostess of the Wordshop Open Mic in Rockford, Illinois, first African-American poet to produce and direct a spoken word stage play inside Rich South High School in Richton Park, Illinois. She was featured in an online media blog, aplusmedia.com, founded by actor Ashton Kutcher, Punked That 70s Show. Released her first spoken word album, More Than a Woman, Introduction of a Goddess, in 2018 after taking nearly a 1-year hiatus to give birth to 2 twin boys. November of 2019, Goddess Warrior, the poet, became an international spoken word artist when she featured on board the Carnival cruise ship on international waters in Bahamas with The Art of Transparency. In December 2019, Goddess Warrior, the poet, won the People's Choice Award in the Next Showcase Chicago competition, a platform created by Mark Hubbard, former president of the Chicago chapter of the Grammys Midwest Division, and Reggie Ayers. After wowing the crowd and winning the competition, it led to a feature spot for So Far Sound Chicago and her first featured television appearance on Chicago's very own WGN, Channel 9, morning show People to People. Goddess Warrior has also thus performed in several cities and states across the nations, won many awards, performed in slam poetry contests, iHeartRadio podcast appearances via intellectualradio.com, and much more. Goddess the Warrior Poet has a mantra that she lives by, and that's faith over fear, never give in and never give up. Let's welcome Goddess Warrior the Poet.
Oh, man. Microphone condom. You know, I appreciate that. As David mentioned, yes, I consider myself a survivor of domestic violence because I witnessed my father shoot and kill my mother, and in turn, he committed suicide right after. This happened to me and my siblings in the year of 2009. And when it happened, I was present. I was in the room. And the piece that I'm going to read from my book is called In His Eyes. Because right before my father pulled the trigger to take my mother's life, I stared him in his eyes, and I saw that mentally and spiritually, my father was already gone. All right, and after I read this piece, which is pretty short, it's not very long, then I'll talk a little bit more about how I coped with losing two parents, was losing both parents at the same time. This piece is called In His Eyes. I'll never forget that look. It was August, but his eyes made it the coldest winter ever. Standing stone cold in front of me, completely void, lacking empathy, tortured and damaged. Heartbreak was his diagnosis. So out of his mind, you would think he was under hypnosis, totally focused on the goal at hand, to put all of his misery to an ultimate end. Full arm extend, pistol clenched in hand. Those eyes, man, those eyes didn't belong to my dad. It hurt me to see him hurting so bad. Depths of darkness deeply desecrated his being. No soul glow, just a vessel of shadows. A dead man before he was even dead. Man, I'll never forget that look. It was August, but his eyes made it the coldest winter ever. In peace. The next poem that I'm going to do is actually what I do all the time, which is spoken word performances. I'm going to perform the next piece. It is actually called Coping with Depression. I lost my parents in 2009. I've been writing poetry my entire life. I've always won essays and contests, writing contests in school for writing. So I've always been a writer at heart. After 2009, though, I put my pen down, my notebook. I just dropped everything because I was so hurt, so traumatized from this experience. I didn't start back doing poetry until 2012. Next year will be 10 years that I have been publicly speaking and sharing my story and performing and doing spoken word. What I will say is that prior to getting any type of therapy or speaking with anyone, I spoke on open mics. It was spoken word and poetry that allowed me to cope, to feel like I was having any form or any outlet for release. what I was going through personally in my heart. When I lost my mother and my father at the same time, I was 22 years old. I had just completed my first year as a freshman in college, and I think I was maybe a sophomore going into my junior year in college. And I left school, I quit school. It was just tough to transition from having two parents. I was living with my mom, didn't have no bills, you know, and to be able to have to be forced in a position to where now I have to live my life without the two people who was literally taking care of me the past 22 years of my life. So you talk about coping and managing. I want to say that for me, I did everything that I could to keep busy so that I wouldn't have to feel. I had gotten so numb to my own pain and hurt that I began to project that pain and hurt onto others. So all of my relationships failed, my friendships failed. I couldn't hold on to a job. I was just in this deep, dark spiral trying to figure it out, right? And so this was the poem that I wrote that led into my process to begin the healing, if that makes sense. This was the piece that I wrote that I felt I was yelling at God. I was ready to release everything that I had, and I said, God, why? All the time, you know, you asking God, why this, why that? We're questioning God. Why did this have to happen to me? This was the piece that I wrote that I was crying out to the Most High and truly expressing and asking why. And God spoke back. And it goes something like this. Is it okay if I move this out the way? Just for a second. Is there an antibiotic for the brokenhearted? You see, before we can resolve any of the pain, we must first understand the roots to the problem, because it be throbbing, an unbearable ache, and no matter how far we run, there seems to be no escape. But make no mistake, this life is a hard-fought race, and God been holding the baton. All you got to do is reach. See, I remember that was me in your seat, feeling incomplete, beat. Could have asked Muhammad Ali that even the greatest of greats eventually face defeat. Now let me tell you about the greatest loss for me. Still battling losing my mother at the age of 23. You see, there was absolutely no predicting that I would soon be a survivor and a victim. I mean, how could I forgive him? Not only did he take my mother's life, but just a few short hours later, my father committed suicide. Now, how do I stay alive, feeling cheated and deprived, forced to bury my parents at the exact same time? I cried, and I tried. Days I felt too weak to smile and too down to rise. But a life of depression is not my demise. Lord, I can't even close my eyes because my dreams are now memories. Images of his finger on the trigger as the first bullet flew past my cheek. One slight turn and I could have caught that bullet with my teeth. I went weeks with no sleep, irritated, aggravated, and angry. They said if I believed in Jesus Christ that he would save me. Well, I was raised in the church. So when Daddy had the gun in his hand, why didn't he come to save her? See, my mother prayed on a regular. And though she wasn't a saint, I could think of no reason to validate why she had to die that way. 2 funerals, 1 day, back-to-back deaths. What more can I give when I have nothing left? Chronic pains in my chest telling me to inhale and take deep breaths. But tell me, how can I breathe when I'm feeling lifeless? My mind filled with stress, depressed. Gotta be strong for my family, so my own feelings I suppress. I said, Father God, where are you? Yo, I've been feeling some neglect. He said, though you may not see my footprints, oh, I've been there every step, caught every tear as you wept. You see, it wasn't God that left. He remained on the premises when I vacated myself. See, when you're down and depressed, it is only the Most High God who can help. Nothing and no one else could take away the pains I felt, like bruises from a belt. I never thought that I would heal from the welts. When he gave me just a little bit of strength, I had to ask him, Father God, why? Why did both of my parents have to die? And this was his reply. Though you may not forced your daddy's hand. Please understand that in my will, there's a plan. Not for them, but for you. You see, every soldier must complete a course of obstacles before entering the battle. And life is a series of tests. But how will you pass the final exam if you never understand my lessons? Left you with my words and you failed to hear the message. So here's the antidote for your depression. 2 cc's of love, a dose of hope, and a mustard seed. All it takes is a mustard seed. Where's your faith? Do you believe that you are worthy to be free? He said, even your parents came from me. So that would make you a child of God too. And as for me, my child, he says, oh, I never abandon my children, though they may go astray and even often roam. Every child of God knows it's no place like home. Thank you so much. Just to kind of close out here, I don't want to go past my time. I want to say that since losing my parents and sharing this testimony and sharing this story, I advocate for a domestic. Thank you. Since going through this traumatic experience and since 2012, being able to have the courage to get in front of people and even say that this happened to me, because at first I dealt with shame. I was ashamed of what happened. I was ashamed to say my father killed my mother. I was so ashamed. I think I dealt with more shame than pain and hurt of missing them. It was the shame because I tell you something, I didn't grow up in a violent household. I didn't grow up with my father beating on my mother. It was one of those traumatic love stories that I'm writing about right now because I want to show that my father was mentally ill. And when it came to them getting ready to separate and divorce, he was not going to live without her. So that's why my father took my mother's life and took his own. Now, I'm not validating what he did because it was wrong nonetheless, but I'm understanding it a little bit more to where I was able to forgive my father. And that is what allowed me the strength to stand before you and young people. Because I tell y'all, it's young people now in this world period who are still losing their mothers to domestic violence. They're still seeing their mothers being beat on. One day they're seeing they're going to school with their friends, and then the next day they're not. So children and young people, young adults, we experience trauma on different levels. And so what I do with my poetry and with me, period, because I am an example that as long as you continue to push through in faith and with this art form, that you can reach somebody, that you can be a beacon of light and a beacon of hope. And that's exactly what I want to do with my poetry and with my spoken word. As he read in my bio, you're looking at me now as an award-winning artist, as an international spoken word artist, a published author. Yeah, I got a lot of accolades and accomplishments, but this came after. This came after the trauma. Because prior to that, I was just like everybody else in this room, just like a lot of people out here in this world, suffering, coping with my trauma, coping with my depression. It was art, it was light, it was having positive people around me who continue to speak life into me because they knew that I was a writer. And they pushed me to continue to write and to put my story in front of people saying, hey, you never know, you can help somebody. So that's what I'm here to do today for everybody here in this room and all the people out there watching. I hope that I was able to be an example to you and what you're going through right now, that as long as you continue to move forward, you will come out. But you got to go through in order to come out, and I hope that makes sense. In other words, there's no way over it, there's no way up under it, and there's no way around it. There's no way around it. You got to go through. So I hope you guys stand tall, stand strong, and go through so that you can make it and find your way out. Peace and love. Again, my book also is called Poems and Petty Shit, because clearly I've been through some petty shit in my life, right? Just like a lot of you. This book is also available on Amazon right now, and I have a few copies here with me as well. I would appreciate your support. Again, thank you for your time.
Man, I'm glad I went before, Zeus. the cadence and the rhythm that you have is just so wonderful. Man, I could listen to it all day. And thank you. It takes, to get up to this podium and speak, it's as if there were 1,000 people here, and you make it look so easy. And I know it took a long time to get there. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The next guy is going to go pee first. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be right back.
This is my condom. I have these, you guys know who Brett Kavanaugh is? He's a icky fucking bitch of a man on the Supreme Court. I made these for a poster. I want to, they just recently outlawed abortion in Texas. So I want to sell these for $20. Anything goes to Iowa to pay what is a good thing to give for pro-abortion thing. Pro-choice, if you want to buy. So when I've started doing what's that? My name is Jesus Correa. Thank you. I was named after my father, who was named after his father, who was named after his father. My dad's a liar. Fun fact about my dad, he's a fucking liar, and he taught me how to lie so good, I can't tell if I'm telling the truth to myself sometimes. So David invited me, and I've always liked doing this. I used to be like, I remember losing a poetry slam to some old lady in the basement of the Rockford Public Library, and she wrote a slam poem about apples, and I was like, this fucking old bitch. Just because she's gonna die soon, and she understands rhyming schemes. And I was pouring my heart. I was so mad about invading Iraq in 2003, and I was so self-righteous, and I got beat by this old lady. I got second place. So I was like, fuck this poetry shit. I started doing stand-up comedy.
That works too, man.
Talking about it, you reminded me of something. I'm gonna read like stuff. You know, I can read. I'm not avoiding it because I do know how to read. You know what I'm saying? I am literate. I might not look like it. But you reminded me, this is a Charles Manson t-shirt. I used to have one just like it in the 8th grade. And I remember going on a school field trip and I bought this Charles Manson t-shirt. I don't want to get into it. He's a scumbag. Charles Manson's a complete scumbag. And used to read Helter. When I was in the 8th grade, I was like, wow, what a cool guy. and Axl Rose was wearing a Charlie Don't Surf t-shirt. So I was wearing that. And I was wearing a pair of a Mickey Mouse hat that I stole from Disney World. Me and my cousins had like a contest to see who could steal the most merchandise from Disney World. I won. I won still about $300 worth of merchandise from Disney World. I remember I stole a Mickey Mouse about yay high. This is how you steal. You didn't learn it from me, but you just grab a thing and you walk out like you own it. So this is mine. I was like, oh, no. You don't hide it in your pants because they see you walking around. I almost got caught stealing hair dye in the 8th grade at a grocery store, trying to slip it down my pants. This is suspicious. What you just walk out. I was like, yeah, this is mine. So I stole a Mickey Mouse about yay high. I just grabbed it by his head and walked out. And this is mine. I gave it to this girl. Jama was her name, and she took her roller skates and kicked me in my testicles with the rubber like hard part and just dropped me real hard. And it made me so mad. And then I remember walking around. You remember the waterfront? You know what that is. So I was walking around and somebody's like, Jesse. And nobody calls me Jesse for a long time. My name's Jesus. It's my fucking name. But my dad wanted me to be a white kid so bad and not have issues and not understand his drug deal things, which is all I understand in Spanish now. But try to keep me in the dark. But so he's like, just go by Jesse. It's easier. It's going to make your life easier. So I did for a bit. So this girl was like, hey, Jesse. I hadn't heard it in years. I looked over, and there's this girl in a wheelchair. And she's like, you remember me as Jamie? I was like, that's what you get for kicking me in the balls with a roller skate. Now you're on wheels forever, aren't you? You're pretty much a human roller skate now, aren't you? My kids are out of control, you know what I'm saying? Little Magellan came up to me the other day and he was like, "Hey, Daddy, tell me again about when you made love to Shakira." And I was like, "Hey, there's a time and a place." Always would get graphic about that stuff. I actually did write a book. See, this is a book, and there are no more for sale. But here's the thing: I'm such a kind man. I have an Instagram account called Ice Cream the Book, and you can read my whole book almost for free. I didn't print the whole thing yet, but I want to build anticipation. But if you do want to read this book, it's going to be all up there sooner rather than later, something like that. I'm going to read a couple of stories from this. What's that? Go get 'em, Tiger. I'm scared. I stood there naked in front of the gathered mass of humanity, with all the folks listening in on their radios, all of their television sets broadcast to be live, standing there naked. "I am scared," I said. They collectively cheered very loudly, strongly, extremely coherently. "I feel like a newborn baby, a scared, lonely little baby," I mumbled under my breath. They chanted my name and pumped their glorious fists in the air. "I feel tiny and lost, and I have little to no hope or faith. Not in myself or the people in the world around me," I said, quivering, now moved to tears as they shouted, "Glory to God!" and "Hallelujah!" And many of them joined me in openly weeping. An old woman approached me with her arms spread open, wanting to embracing me, needing to console me. People began making love in the streets, in their motor vehicles, wherever they happened to be. They began frantically fornicating in hopes that they would conceive a child they would name after me, be it a boy or a girl or a transgendered child. If there is a God, and I seriously doubt there is one, but if some really, really, really unlikely chance that there is indeed a God, this God has surely turned its back on us all, I said, laying there naked in the fetal position. Many people at that moment felt that was the apex of their existence, and many of them threw themselves through windows and skyscrapers, feeling glorious and LSD high just from the frequency and the weight of my words. We are all so utterly doomed and alone. We're all gonna die alone. I'm so afraid for you all. A man ate his baby, and we all collectively lay down together and napped for about half of an hour before going back to the business at hand, buying the tampons, eating the McRibs, drinking the Miller Lights, watching the television programs that lulled us all to sleep. Sorry, is everybody okay? No, I didn't want to. I was not waiting for an applause. I just didn't know if we understood that was over with. I get real loud and then I back off. So I was like digging through old notebooks, like from even 20 years ago. When I was 15 years old, I was convinced I'm going to be the greatest writer in the world. And reading was just trash and cliches and, awful stuff. And like trying to be profound when you're just a dumb kid. And you're just like, I got it all figured out. I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best. And it's just never the case. But sometimes, I make myself laugh, and then that's my favorite thing to do, is stare into the abyss and have a little giggle, you know. Stare into the eyes of Satan, which happen to be mine, and say, oh. This is a real, I'm not even going to apologize. It's just bouncing. Put mayonnaise on my blue cheese and then smear it on my tuna fish sandwich with bacon and ham on it. Then deep fry it in cow lard and garnish it with the slices of bologna and a bratwurst. I want 3 hot dogs drenched in bacon fat and microwaved with 5 slices of American cheese. And mozzarella sticks with steak bits and pork chops injected into it. I want a hamburger with 6 meatballs covered in Swiss cheese. And provolone on white bread deep fried in Crisco with pork rinds and Doritos and salsa and Mountain Dew flavored Doritos and Dorito flavored Mountain Dew. I made that last part up as I was going. Barbecued ribs injected with goat cheese floating in a thick chicken broth on top of a Gordish came hen drenched in Parmesan cheese and a Thousand Island dressing and orange Fanta. When I went to Mexico in this 1986, I drink soda pop out of plastic sandwich bags. And I came back to Rockford, living in a trailer court. My dad, I didn't have a dad for 3 months because he was illegal. My dad came here when he was 15 years old. He was into gangs and uppers and downs. He was a wild man. He used to party with David's father. We were talking with earlier, my dad and his dad used to do a couple lines of cocaine and come pulling up, drinking some Jack and Cokes and pick us up from this church setting thing where we would play cops and ninjas. How much longer I got? 5 minutes. An unguarded machine is an unsafe machine. I found that on a piece of paper. That's great advice. So look, I'm glad I wrote that down. This is, I don't know where this came from, but I've never felt like a vigilante, but for some reason, like, I used to live just up the street. I got carbon monoxide poisoning just up the street here, and I used to write on this typewriter there sitting in the window. So I do remember writing this there, but I don't remember what my attitude was about this. Forgive me. I'm trying to give you the full spectrum of me, baby. You know what I'm saying? The whole rainbow that is my nasty little self. I almost died so many times. I had a story about I dropped a blow dryer in the bathtub when I was 4 years old. I was playing with my mom, left her like fucking blow dryer, thing in. I was like, we don't have a swimming pool, so I'm just taking a little bath in cold water. I'll play with my mom's ray gun. Boom, drop it in. I get electrocuted. Smurf story. I had it. It's like 4 or 5 pages. It's too long. I boom, boom. I lit myself on fire at Mary's place, 2002, almost, burned myself on fire. I fell off the Congress Theater on Valentine's Day in 2010. Ask me about it after the show, baby. I could talk all day. Sitting nestled in some cliche, it doesn't matter what it is, you've heard it 1,000 times before. Of course, it's raining. Of course, there is sad music and a troubled mind. There is the self-doubt. It's all there, everything you'd need for a half-assed setup. So there you are, and you look out the window, and the traffic's just flying by, and you don't know one of those people in any one of those automobiles, and you probably never will, but they're part of the whole thing. They're making up the background noise. They're adding to the atmosphere and the mood, the lonely mood that is becoming every corner of your apartment. So it's raining, and you look out the window again. You look at that little corner where the house sits. You look at it covered in water. You wonder for a moment how long you could survive shacked up in here if it flooded out there. Wonder if there would be anybody to save. Wonder if there would be anyone worth saving. Wonder if this is any time to start playing hero. The cars trudge along unaware they are part of some cliche. They trudge along spraying water on one another, and they remind you of big dumb kids in some oversized swimming pool. And as you stare out the window, one of the biggest and dumbest of those kids shoots you a look from his 18-wheeler. You can see his eyes glazed over from Rush Limbaugh, God rest his soul. I honestly hope he's burning in hell, but that's just me. Okay. Fuck him. But he still snuck in that look. Out of the haze, right into your nice, relaxing cliche. Now you sit there, and there's anger sneaking in through that hole he burned into your window with his glare. And everything around you is losing its purpose. Your cliche is losing steam, even as your old head is filling with it. Your chest is filled with some fire now. It burns with passion and something akin to hatred. And for a split second, you hope his big rig crashes so you can grab him by his collar and shake some sense into him. You want to tell him, you can't just go around fucking up folks' cliches, bro. You can't just stare in their windows and wreck their whole afternoon. You stole the serene blandness that I was rolling around. You stole it from me. Then you might slap him, you thought. Then you hear a crash. You hear a crash. You run to a window in another room and look out upon the mess of steel hamburger buns floating in the gutter as he was delivering hamburger buns in it. And a man peeling himself from his mangled cage that used to be his truck. You don't think you just throw on a sweatshirt and some shoes and run downstairs, already screaming what you will soon be screaming in his bloodied face, and you get out the door and you walk calmly towards him, and he looks in your direction. He sees your mouth moving, and he hears the noise coming from it, though you can't quite make it out. You get next to him, and you can hear him say, I need help. And you calmly yell at him that, yes, he does need help, because decent people don't drive around stealing people's cliches from them. Decent people don't drive around like fucking cocksuckers, pretending they are God and decide whose day should be ruined by his fucking icy stare. He says, please, I'm hurt, please. And you realize he doesn't know that you're talking about. He doesn't even recognize you. This fucking asshole goes around randomly ruining people's days, and he does not even bother to remember, and you realize he's done this before. And he'll do it again. And you wonder how many times has this bastard swooped down and just that smashed the face off some other folks' perfectly wonderful, boring days. And you realize he has no pity or shame about the thing. He will do this again and again and again. That is, if you let him. How many people's days will you save if he dies right here? And you don't want the glory or the praise. You just want to know that people can live their lives in their own boring fashion without this man's judgmental eyes shooting the whole thing down. Your hand trembles with anticipation, and the sky opens up and spits all the rain it has in its guts down upon the two of you as you open up your pocket knife. And you grab his head, and you pull him to you, and you stare him in his eyes as best you can before you look upon the heavens, before you slide that blade into his bastard guts. And the rain lets up, and a cop pulls up, and he sees the two of you covered in blood. You leave the blade inside of his body and let him go, and he falls as you walk away. The cops tell you to stop, but their laws do not apply to you anymore. The kind of justice that they involve themselves with, the piddly beats they walk, that kind of justice is dirt beneath your feet. You continue walking as they spew out their own cliches. Freeze, or we'll shoot you. Put your hands on your head. Get down on your knees. And you realize you have restored order to the world. The very fact that they speak these cliches is thanks to you and your blind, decisive action. You ignore their warnings and continue walking. You hear footsteps coming towards you, and you turn to face the cop as he opens his up his arms to procure you, to procure you, to procure you. You fall to the ground, and he is helpless to stop with the rein, and he trips over you. The other cop draws his weapon and heads toward you as you rise from the street. He is halfway towards you as you lift your leg, and he yells and pleads towards you as you lift your leg up, and he yells and pleads, are not to be heeded. Why did I write these? No, that's really bad. Could I read one more real quick thing? Because I really was not happy with that thing.
It's going good for a minute.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I love you, Michael. I'm so sorry. Okay, this is it. I swear. A man telling his son he's going to die. Your daddy's going to die, Joey. Your daddy's going to die. You're not going to have a daddy anymore, Joey, I said to my son, whose name was Joey. Good, he said. I'm very excited. That sounds great to me. He began marching around our living room, mimicking the act of playing the trombone. After your mother killed herself, I began slowly poisoning myself by putting a tiny amount of arsenic in my tea each morning. From what I understand about arsenic, I am in the beginning throes of death, my boy. Yes, dear Joey, your daddy is not long for this world. I said to my 4-year-old son, who stood there in his pajamas, clapping his hands enthusiastically, chanting, "No more daddy! No more daddy!" That's right, Joey, no more daddy. You're going to be an orphan, buddy. You're going to have to learn to fend for yourself, and that's going to be very hard for you because you are dim-witted and repulsive to look at. You're probably going to end up with a terrible, crippling drug habit if you don't starve to death first. Daddy's going to die, and I'm afraid, my son, that there's no hope for you, I said to my son as he jumped up and down on the couch joyously, soaring and cackling things like, I cannot wait to not have a daddy! I cannot wait until you die! No more daddies forever! No more daddies forever! He was pissing his pants, and he was pleased to punch, and frankly, so was I. Today was the greatest day that I have ever known. Thank you, Jesus. I'm so sorry.
Jesus Correa, everybody. Me and Jesus go way back. We were 12 years old. First thing you ever did to me was hit me in my face. You slapped me in my face. Yes. Okay. I wouldn't change a thing either. This next guy is Tim Stotz. I've known Tim for a very long time. I'm very excited to have him here. I probably don't need the double masker here. Tim Stotz is a guy from Elkton, Missouri, where he was not a gentleman farmer. Nevertheless, he was born somewhere else and has lived in Rockford forever, with a few insufferable periods in Houston. He won the Grimes Prize for fiction. His stories have appeared in The Feast, Horizons, The Eclectic Screwdriver, and Operating the Milling Machines for Chrysler 3.7-liter engine, among others. He's been retweeted by James Gunn, Eric Idle, Dan Harmon, and Rob Thomas. No, not the guy. No, the guy who created Veronica Mars and Party Down. I butchered that. I'm sorry, Tim. He writes scripts, so forming complete sentences equals no. As he gets older, he loses more and more coping mechanisms for his dyslexia, but he also gets cranky enough not to care. He has no regrets except that he's never made moonshine or a hovercraft. And also that he has a lot of other regrets. I'm sorry. Generally regarded as a motor mouth asshole, mostly harmless, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tim Stotz. Sorry, I butchered that.
All right, now you're safe from me. Okay. My piece is called The Woman Who Couldn't Die Until She Did. In the early 80s, I was pretty young when my mom fell into a diabetic coma. Type 1, the kind where your pancreas pretty much takes its ball and goes home. I didn't understand it at the time, how grave it was and all that stuff. My grandfather on my dad's side had it too, and he seemed fine, if a little crabby most of the time. It was a hell of a way to find out you have a disease, almost checking out from that disease. Taking a big nap only to wake up and have someone in a lab coat say, "Good morning, you're a diabetic," as they stabbed an orange with a syringe to demonstrate a new daily routine Mom would have to learn. I never really knew that diabetes, or diabetes as we called it in the hinterland, could be life-threatening, or that a coma was something even pretty stalwart folks refused to wake up from most of the time. Grandparents and my dad kept us informed, but insulated us from a lot of the severity of it. The young minds of my siblings and me could tell there was a heaviness, but we didn't complain too much about more time with the grandparents. I got suspicious when my grandmother cooked fried chicken, a Sunday meal, on a weekday. But really, probably it was all no big deal, I kind of thought. My mom, you see, used to joke somewhat frequently about the fact she died. Coded is the polite and more clinical term for it. I forget the circumstances around her brief and far from final death. She was revived, resuscitated, or whatever, and she was largely unscathed. At least okay enough to laugh about it years later. She joked that she had a death certificate around somewhere, but I never saw that. Maybe that part was apocryphal. I didn't understand mortality as a kid. I don't understand it now, and I'd wager money that doesn't jingle that neither do any of us, really. She was so casual about it, it was a story in the past. She told it with the same gusto and almost third-person detachment as the time she entered the Miss O'Fallon pageant as a goof and won. She had pictures of that, unlike the death certificate. So that's right, I come from pageant stock. Of both surreal experiences, she wound up being fine, so no big deal. This coma was not a big deal either, surely. She woke up and looked and acted like she always did from my oblivious, childlike perspective. She had to give herself 2 insulin shots a day. That freaked me out a bit at first. I was never bad about getting my shots as a kid, but wasn't a fan of them either. She practiced the shots at home on the aforementioned orange. My brother saw the orange and wanted it. My mom thought it was wise that we got him a different one. That was the most direct drama that surrounded the new normal at first. My siblings and I were curious sorts, always taking things apart and playing with things from the adult world. To clarify, I don't mean dildos and stuff, just not toys. As a precaution, Mom disposed of her insulin needles in a Planters cheese puff container, a tin that happened to be the right length for the needles and suitably rigid. That kept the syringes away from us and other amateur pharmacology enthusiasts, at least well enough. Not cleared for medical waste, but it was the 80s. We barely wore seatbelts. In the early days, the most discernible way her bum pancreas affected us was her one-woman crusade against sugar. Not just for her, but it trickled down to us kids. We were miserable. We were despondent. We ate carob. That time period had a messed up definition of healthy. Sugary candy bars were replaced by even more sugary granola. These little bits of science fiction-y styrofoam called wheat germ were suitable natural snacks, with at least as much trans fats and salt as anything coming out of the Lay's Petri dish. We ate a lot of nutritious bread, whole wheat, Roman meal. It was exactly the same as white bread, but they added brown food coloring. So, natural. I don't know what made her reverse her decision, but eventually, and all of a sudden, we could do sugar again. This was one of the first erratic decisions or swings of perspective that she had. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just glad candy bars were back on the menu. It still confused me, though. There were many more wild swings of perspective that came about through the years, and I never knew entirely where I stood, at least most of the time. Mom had allowed us to cuss at a very early age, but only in the home, and there were some forbidden words that concerned the melanin count of people's skin, their gender, and who they wanted to fuck, stuff like that. And I still live by those rules today. I do take the Lord's name in vain, though, quite a lot. but it's a victimless crime, so no big. Despite the freedom of lexicographical looseness and other inalienable rights, we had rigid clampdowns and other things my peers did not. Like, we always had pretty early bedtimes. It was a confusing mix of freedom and restriction. The net result is a 5-year-old saying, "I don't want to go to fucking bed." As I'm in bed while the sun is still up in the summer, I remember thinking, how is this fair? How is this good for me? And it wasn't really about us. She wanted to live an adult life bereft of kids for a little while. I mean, I understand that now. I had an end run around this, though. When her friends came over, that was my time to shine. My first foray into show business, no doubt. By virtue of being a tiny human with a big personality, her friends loved my shtick. She tried to usher me to bed, but the friends wanted me to stay. I had the Nielsen's. The focus group had spoken. I tested well with young 20-year-old women, and they wanted sequels. "Okay, Tim, time for bed." "No, let him stay up. He's adorable." I mean, I knew I'd hear about it from her later, but I mean, I was smitten. I thought it was really a showman. Turns out, making 20-year-old stoners laugh was not the bellwether of entertainment that I thought it was. That having been said, they're still among my favorite crowds. When we moved down to Houston, Texas, a thing I don't recommend, the area was a bit more conservative. My parents smoked pot a lot, pretty much all day. We could never have friends over, and if a friend dared randomly pop over, it was chaos. Aliens were at the airlock. My parents would go through the motions of trying to make the place not smell like an opium den so they could merely open the door and tell them, "No, you can't come in." Then I would get in trouble. I mean, that seemed unfair, and it was. I was a kid. I was expected to be up on drug culture as much as Hunter S. Thompson back then. I mean, I didn't know. And plus, I didn't have it in control when these weirdos showed up at my door. What made less sense even is it was a whole ordeal for me to go to my friends' houses, like trying to get a covert operation approved to cross the Iron Curtain. It was so much trouble I just didn't do it after a while, and I withdrew. One of my earliest memories is when I rolled up a page from the TV guide into a tube and said to my straight-laced grandmother, "Hey, Grandma, want to folk a joint?" This came back to haunt my mom, and I got in trouble. I was barely verbal, and she acted like I ratted her out. I didn't know I was doing wrong. After seeing her friends sit in a circle and puff, puff, pass, I thought this is what people do in social situations. This is an extension of goodwill. Plus, I'm not a narc. My grandma almost took me away from my mom then. I was on the fence about that and sort of wanted it to happen. But back then, before my brother and sister were born, and my mom had not yet met my adoptive father, it was sort of us against the world, and I figured that it would be wrong to cut and run. For my loyalty, I was rewarded with the confusing, contradictory rules about always telling the truth, but never telling the whole truth about pot smoking and the scuzzy fuckers who were hanging around. To be clear, they weren't scuzzy because they smoked pot. They were scuzzy and they smoked pot. A very strict and limiting crackdown on going to my grandma's house ensued. Lots of extra rules were enforced on me to hide that lifestyle. I need to be very clear. I'm not anti-pot. I mean, I don't do it much, especially compared to drinking. There was no taboo. It wasn't this forbidden thing. It was a thing my boring parents did that I never cared much to do. I also never watched soap operas or ate Brussels sprouts. You know, boring parent shit. Adults with kids need adult time, but I never think she quite figured out that balance very well. Despite being a house that valued creativity and free expression, including cussing, I was allowed to watch R movies far later than many of my peers. Maybe my ability to dissect structure and writing styles came from that. I had to fake reviews with my peers so I wouldn't seem like a square. Wasn't it great when the lady showed us all her boobs and did the sex? Man, that was sweet. I mean, it was good enough to fool them anyway. Then one day she was all, "Fine, watch what you want." I mean, awesome, but that confused me too. I mean, I thought maybe it was a trap. I mean, was I going to hear about this? But don't worry, she wasn't always overbearing. There was also neglect. We kids were left to fend for ourselves quite a bit. In her defense, it was the 70s and 80s. We were about 5 years away from being Dickensian chimney sweeps as far as the societal mores and folkways were concerned. Being left to your own devices is pretty wonderful for a kid with an imagination and a love of reading, and who didn't really want to be scolded all the time. I learned that I couldn't go to my parents for help with pretty much anything. Any complaint would result in, "Thank you for sharing." A glib pop psychology phrase parents were told to employ when their kids were being needy. That era was rife with so many pop psychology shitty ideas, like tough love. I mean, if you see someone who is suicidal, tell them to jump. Call their bluff. They'll thank you for it and consider you their savior. And they will snap out of it like all people who are faking depression or other types of being non-neurotypical. Different times. I'm biased. I can't attest to how needy or not I was, but as an outsider, I can assure you my brother and sister were not. I resented the malaise with which my parents treated those two younger people, whose lives were just starting to form. I mean, it was the Carter era. There was a lot of malaise going around, so I don't know. No one asked me to be an honorary parent, but I slid into the role and probably fucked it up as much as mom and dad did. Nature hates a vacuum, though, and I saw a need. I did what I could, a 7-year-old dad. If a kid wanted to fight me, this is just another example, or like bully me, I would get in trouble. My hippy-dippy mom thought I should be some kind of peace broker with irrational sociopaths. I mean, I never threw a punch or anything. I got it from both sides, from two bullies. It was such an uncertain, unstable time. Toward the end of 2nd grade, I was the only of her kids in school. Mom whisked us away to a vacation, though school hadn't quite ended yet. When we returned, I told Mom, I think school is actually over. She was angry and thought I was trying to pull a fast one. I relented right away, half because of the anger, half because she was an adult. Adults always know what's going on. I mean, surely she would at least know the fucking last day of school. I walked into my class a bit late, and there were none of the students that I knew as classmates present. The teacher, who decidedly was not my teacher, asked who I was. School was indeed out for summer. Summer school had indeed started, a minor detail missed by my mom. The teachers and administrators called home. They were more incredulous than mad. Mom came in and got me and apologized to them, not me. I knew I couldn't call her on the carpet for that because she was never emotionally there for me. I was expected to be there for her. This pattern went on for my whole life, culminating around high school. Restrictions were levied and then abandoned on a whim, then reintroduced seemingly unbidden of none of my behavior. My life was carob and candy, and I got used to it. It became part of my identity. In high school, there was a change, though. She graduated to full-on cool mom status. All of my friends were jealous. She let me do pretty much what I wanted. She let us drink there and even smoke my friends up a few times. She and Dad said they raised me to be independent. I saw through that bullshit. But I was getting to do whatever I wanted, so I didn't complain at the time. I mean, I had a lot of problems, but I could deal with them myself, right? And the cats in the cradle and the silver spoon and so on and so on. There were a few times she realized I was acting maybe a little too wild, drinking out all hours of the night, and she thought she would rein me in. No. The genie was out of the bottle. I was too old, too tired of the shit, and I just kept doing what I wanted. I was still in the honor roll and all that. Fuck her. I was handling it. How dare she step in and be a parent now? I'll spare you from all the other misdeeds and emotional ups and downs and downright abuse because you've probably heard enough and you have your own problems. There's nothing much less charismatic than an adult droning on about all that. Suffice it to say, I coped. In a healthy way? Well, that's another question. As I became older, I started talking to my mom every now and again about some of those uglier moments, sometimes in anger, and rare occasion, she would even cop to the fact her behavior wasn't cool at the time. It was something of a healing process. No excuse for it, but I saw her as a human, as flawed, a complex human, going through a lot of shit herself. There were good times, but also that lifetime of grievances. I needed her at least to acknowledge that she fucked up. I needed that dialogue to continue. It had to be parceled out in delicate diplomatic packets, not a fire hose of fuck you. She was pretty fragile emotionally most of the time. Sometimes we looked back on the bullshit and laughed. Mine was never a genuine laugh, but it was how the situation went smoothly, how I ameliorated the emotional turmoil. I moved around a lot as a kid, and humor was my way to make new, if superficial, friends, and I applied that to most conversations with my mom. On occasion, Mom and I would have a breakthrough moment, though. Total honesty. Maybe it would be the other thing, too, though, where I just dropped it. I acted accordingly and read the room. I was a good actor even then. Her diabetes started getting worse. More brittle is what they called it. Her blood sugar swung wildly, low, high. Very few people die of diabetes. They die of the things it does to you, to your organs. One of the earliest casualties, heart problems. She took a chemical pacemaker called Norpace to treat a mitovalvular prolapse. It seemed to work from an outside perspective. She looked the same, all that. Just another mysterious pill added to the arsenal of invisible ailments. But her kidneys and vision started to falter eventually, much later. About the time I went to college, a little bit before. It started getting really bad. We took her to get laser eye treatment to help a detached retina, and it seemed to help, but never all the way. It just kept coming. Maybe this time it'd work. But at best, we stalled the inevitable. And she could still sort of see. We got in a pretty big fight before I went to college, and I was kicked out of the house. I didn't leave. I was going to college in 3 days. Sure, I'll leave, but on my fucking timetable. After a lifetime of capricious, arbitrary rules, I was not going to let it affect me too much. That's not to say I wasn't tense there. Shortly after I got up here to college, I got a knock on my door. I'd received a care package ordered to the college from Mom. It was a box full of pens, candy, microwave popcorn. I called her uncertainly. She acted as if we were cool, like I hadn't been kicked out of the house. I just went with it. Mom was there at the house, all alone. She and Dad had divorced finally after many splits. Dad had manipulated my brother and sister to go live with him. After the misguided loyalty I showed way back in the day, I resented them for it, but also maybe envied them. On top of that, my mom's dog, a huge, adorably oafish Great Pyrenees, got hit by a car. She was well and truly alone after the motorist bounded up to our door, crying with the giant dog in his arms. And despite all the bad times, I hated that loneliness for her. Money was tight most of the time. Mom had none. Her health made it pretty hard to work, and she was taken by healing crystal charlatans that were going to help her health. They didn't. Very expensive false hope from very bad people. I tried to compartmentalize her being there alone and me being up here surrounded by people but also very much alone as best I could. It had almost worked. I knew her health was getting worse, but things were already pretty bad, so where do you find the baseline? Where do you find the equilibrium? My grandparents, her parents, wintered in Yuma, Arizona. They were on the return trip and tried to get a hold of her and couldn't. They raced over to her house and found her in bed, clinically depressed, out of insulin, out of food, and by her account, she had given up. No food, no insulin, a dangerous cocktail for a diabetic. Pretty much anybody, but especially a diabetic. They rushed her to the hospital. She was very close to death, but she survived. And I never felt more guilty about anything in my life, her being alone there, going through that. I don't expect I ever will. Mom did rally. My grandparents took care of her, not just in the short term, but they lived with her, and she lived with them. She couldn't take very good care of herself at that point. I visited them as often as I could, sometimes in Missouri, sometimes in Yuma. Her parents were once again being parents in a way they hadn't in some time. The rebellious daughter, a daughter who resented them for reasons I could never fathom, was now once again in their care. And my grandparents were lovely, also with some faults, but they also kept her alive, and they got along for the most part, it seemed. Gone were the days of rancor. They made the best of a bad situation, full of heartache and more joy than you might expect. That's how those things go. Her vision got worse. I used to read to her on cassette tapes and mail them to her. She had gone legally blind. She had a cane, but never learned Braille. She now needed dialysis. But once we figured that out, things seemed stable for a while. The family of mother and father and daughter had fallen into a comfortable complacency, a status quo. And she seemed happy, I told myself, and also envied that stability. So that's what it takes? She had a stroke while I was up in college. It was a pretty bad one. How bad? She died. Don't worry, though, it didn't take. Her vitals crashed and she was unresponsive. They kept her on a machine for a bit, and she woke up. So not just yet. The stroke took a toll, though. Her world, already dark from blindness and small from lack of being able to come and go as she pleased, got even smaller and even darker. She was lucid very often, but never all the way. And sometimes she was very out of it, trapped in her own body and mind. She had many strokes after that. All of them were minor compared to the first one, but they continued to take their toll. And some of those killed her too. But she always bounced back. Every day, I expected a phone call with more bad health news. And I got it really often. It was a merciful reprieve when I didn't get that call. Nevertheless, she always bounced back, though never to her previous state. The first time your mom dies and comes back, it's a miracle. But after half a dozen or so, after getting those phone calls, your mom's dead. No, wait, she's okay. Well, eventually enough is fucking enough. And I hope that sounds cold to you because it means you never had to go through it. In those waning days, my grandparents installed a very expensive private phone line in her hospital room, and I dreaded calling it. I mean, I would. Don't pressure me, I will, okay? The anxiety matriculated a full-on terror of what I would find on the other end of that line, and I tortured myself with that. Maybe knowing would be the better thing than not knowing. She remained in this indeterminate state. Schrodinger's mom, not alive, not dead. And I never got the chance to call that phone. It was only there about a month. And I told myself, after all, she was barely lucid and going through so many procedures. And those were excuses, of course. I was just scared and sad. And was finding out that I inherited dear old mom's clinical depression. I still think about that lonely, expensive, pointless phone, no doubt disinfected daily by the staff, just in case. It was never touched, but just in case. She had one malady that afflicted her not directly related to diabetes, a condition called scleroderma. It was a hardening of the skin from too much collagen production, especially in the face and hands, but also some of the inner soft tissues, hips and esophagus. It is during one of her less than lucid moments she agreed to get a feeding tube installed because the scleroderma had made it so she couldn't swallow. I can picture it, a surgeon patiently explaining the procedure to her in a voice a little louder than normal to try to cut through, her eyes lulled back in her head, and she nodded and said, okay. I wasn't there, but I'm sure this is how it went down. But I wasn't there. The surgery was scheduled and ready to go, but she, in one of her actual lucid moments, said, fuck this. I agreed to what? No. And it was time, the final act. She had cheated death near a dozen times by this point and defied expectations long enough. She couldn't eat, and that tube sounded like a Cronenbergian nightmare, a thing you might consider if a patient were to wake up in a month and bounce back and ship shape, but this was not going to be the fate of my mom. She decided to stop dialysis. That meant she had 1 week, 7 days, on the nose. It always freaks me out when natural things conform to the arbitrary measures of human-made constructs such as time. I mean, why not 4.5 days, 8.6? It gave me enough time that I could scrape together all the money I had to buy a hardship ticket down to Yuma. I was by her side in the hospital by what retroactively would surely be her deathbed. I was there with my grandparents. We were there almost all the time with brief breaks to sleep or eat, stare into space. There was a lot that was left unsaid. When kids become adults, they often want to have some words with their parents. A lot of how dare you and other petty shit like that. Mom and I had done that before, as I said. as I got a bit older, before she was so ill. And as tense as those moments were, they often wound up being healthy, as I also said before. There was so much more to be said, more questions to be asked. I never got a chance, not since about the time she kicked me out of the house. A blind woman who barely knows where she is, who's in pain constantly, makes it real hard to talk about. That fucked up thing you did in the 8th grade, you know what I'm talking about. It was so inconsequential in the grand scheme of things, and I needed it. She never held back in telling her parents what she thought, up until they were once again her caregivers. But no way I could seek that kind of catharsis here, not now, and not ever. Instead, I talked about the good times, tried to keep her in high spirits when her mind was in the same room with me. I didn't have a copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but I recited it to her from memory as best I could. I'd read it so many times. So it wasn't that difficult. And the parts I didn't remember, mixed one part Doctor Who with one part P.G. Wodehouse and Bob's Your Uncle. The guide was one of the most prominent pieces of media we shared. The radio play, the book, the PBS show. She died before the movie came out, so dodge a bullet there, Mom. The guide was the first non-Winnie the Pooh book I read way back when she was having me go to school that was already closed, and I rolled up pages of the TV guide to offer my grandma a folk. I couldn't quite read it at first, so she read it to me. I, toward those last days, returned the favor. The only other pieces of media she enjoyed sharing me with the same zeal were the album Tommy by The Who, and possibly, and very confusingly, Fritz the Cat. A pornographic cartoon with some dubious social commentary that no doubt seemed insightful at the time. Remember, we weren't quite able to watch our movies at the time, much less X. Mom wasn't a prude, but she did think porn was degrading to women. We were pretty surprised to come home from school to see the TV turn to the Playboy channel. My first thought was, did I accidentally leave that on? Oh shit, I'm busted. But she tuned it in so she could share it with us, and I think the cartoon was more fucked up than she remembered as she was watching it with us. I digress. Those last days in the hospital ticked by slower than the entire rest of my life that I lived with her. Little bits of conversation, some 2 ways, some just so she could hear a voice while she was out of it. She kept slipping in and out of lucidity. The room was full of uncertainty between us once again, and just like always. We tackled those lucid moments as we could. We sat and strained heavy silence often when she was in her own world, or at least out of ours. We were there on the 7th day, the scheduled end. My grandma, my grandpa, me. This was the end of the week she had left after quitting her dialysis. All the other stuff was uncertain, unpredictable, and ultimately not fatal, but there was nothing penultimate about it, according to the scrub-dressed people and soothing voices. You have 7 days of your kidneys not doing their thing before you fucked right off to the hereafter, they reassured us. Not in those words exactly. My mom was, however, hanging in there, not in good shape, but not noticeably worse than when I first arrived down in Yuma. Towards the end of the night, the nurse said, "Looks like not today. Might as well go home and come back tomorrow." So much for the 7-day forecast. Mom couldn't do anything right. Fuck. Nevertheless, we lingered, my grandparents and me. We may have had a feeling. We may have been too tired to move. I don't know. I noticed it long before I spoke. I eventually, through a tight throat and tears, said, "She hasn't blinked in a really long time." She was still breathing, staring at the ceiling. Her last words that passed about half an hour previously were, "I'm scared." What do you say to that? No shit, you're scared. You're fucking dying. No poignant, movie-esque parting words or peaceful platitudes. I'm scared. She breathed and stared and breathed and stared. Should we get someone? I mean, is she really dead? Finally? For real? No fake outs? No last-minute rallies? Was my mom dead? The doctors said she was, despite the ragged, aggressive breathing and intense stare, well and truly dead. I still think a little bit they read the room and told a little fib that she was dead, just to get the whole sordid goddamn thing over with. That's what she wanted. That's what we wanted. We had only recently had the fortitude to admit that. Yet, doctors doing a death fake out. This is life and not a Monty Python sketch. And life, it's way more absurd. We closed her eyes like they do in the movies, but she popped them back open. And come the fuck on, Mom. Just die already, can you? Fuck. Dead people do that, though. I've had the unfortunate opportunity to find that out with her and a few other loved ones who have passed. And she wasn't on any life support or anything at that point. We all tried really hard to let her die. Her parents, who did the unthinkable thing and lost a child. Me. And reluctantly, and with no sense of timing, comedic or otherwise, she finally did. It was very hard to tell with the breathing and non-blinking stare, but she did. Numbness and exhaustion far outweighed the sadness. But as soon as I could wake up, I fell apart good and proper. Grief, survivor's guilt, guilt that I was there and my brother and sister couldn't be. Deep sorrow for what my grandparents went through. In an act of pragmatic prudence and mercy, we cremated her before she had the temerity to wake the fuck back up again. I hope she wasn't alive for that. Damn. Even then, the thought for a long time haunted me. Is it over? For real? Do I have to brace myself for what the fuck this day might bring? I mean, I didn't want it to be over, but I also didn't want her to suffer. And that suffering, as far as I can tell, was over. The woman who couldn't die did. I never got over it. I don't know you ever do. My stock phrase, I have made my peace with it. I guess that's true. I mean, it's certainly glib. Maybe it's more to deflect follow-up questions than a true state of my house being in order. It was a long time ago. I can't really remember her voice, not well. I've processed this whole thing as well as I could, maybe. That might be a lie. There's a fine line between dealing with something and being in denial. Several years after she passed, I did digital backgrounds that we projected over the small stage at New American Theater for a production of Tommy. I wish she could have seen that, and with eyes that worked. The snapping in and out of lucidity might have actually helped that play a little bit. I would have loved to have gotten her smoked up one last time while the gypsy, the acid queen, belted out her song. On the appreciation night for all the people who worked on the play, my cohorts at Engine Studio dedicated that performance to her, unbeknownst to me. That meant a lot. I got really choked up. I mean, it gets me low to this day. I'll never get the full-on atonement or apology or any of those much-craved stability items that I wanted. I'll never get to confess that at least some of that was also my fault too. But I know a lot of kids with parents who are still alive who won't either. Thank you.
Tim Stotz. One more time. Come on, man. Well, that's it for the evening. I'm going to just end on a final poem. But before I say that, I want to share just a piece of wisdom that I picked up from many hours of therapy. And that's this. My therapist looked at me and she said, "Dave, is the world fair?" I said, "No." She says, "Well, why do you keep expecting it to be?" That's a hard truth. We are all here, and we have all had trauma. Every single one. We don't know when somebody's yelling at you, when you have an argument, when you leave the house mad. Don't forget. We had 4 people come up today and talk about things they're going through, but I guarantee everybody in this room is going through something or has gone through something similar. So don't be so quick to snap back. We're all people. We're all here together, and we have a job, I believe, to take care of each other. And I'm so glad to be able to share my story, and I'm so glad for you guys to come up here and share your stories. And I'm especially now with COVID and everything, just remember that you're not alone. You're not. Thank you. Yes. That comes, you're off cue, though. You're going to do that later. I give him $50 and he can't even come in on the right cue. Hold on. This is a song, or God, see Jesus. This is a poem I wrote 10 years ago. It's called Of Love. To weaken the blow of breathing without knowledge, to define a previous life, the impossibility of aging without regret, the passing by of a former encounter, a ring positioned around her tiny left hand, a hand that once held your own. Of love, its purpose is overwhelming, though the word itself is meaningless. For we are at the present time the eater of our own foul endeavors, shifting through our condensed generation upon minute distances. A weekend vacation on a short fleeting highway, a carved piece of granite to state the fact that we were inhabitant of this particular planet, our vessel buried beneath the rock, with a face that cannot be summoned simply by remembrance. Of love, we shall not know the enormity of emptiness until we have had a conversation with death. Of love, through the depths of forever to the occupied corners of the universe, we can all hope that our affection will touch something beyond our mortality. We can all pray that when we finally rest, we will only dream of love. Thank you and good night.